get rid
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Do you like pastry or anything for you?
Hello, everybody, and welcome. Sorry for the delay. We're just settling some technical issues, and we'll get started soon. And can everybody see the PowerPoint on your screens? Thank you, Michaela. Yes.
It's circulating ahead.
Hi, everybody. Sorry again for the delay. We're just waiting just one moment to get all the speakers in and everything set up.
So I guess it's open, is it, on the Teams webinar, on the link that we circulated?
Yes,
Okay.
where the registration link is the same as the.
Okay.
Yeah.
So people having difficulty joining?
Yeah, so I think people think that with Eventbrite or whatever, they just need to have that, but they need to go and register in the invite itself.
Yeah, so I've sent everybody who had registered on Eventbrite that link, the webinar link, this afternoon. So hopefully, and that's the link that we shared in our calendar invite as well. So hopefully. I'm going to see if I can just join us.
Okay. Okay, Claudia, Johanna, can you try your sound levels? Let's see if it's working okay.
Do you mean to speak?
Yes.
Okay, did you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Claudia?
Hello. Oh, shit.
Yeah, I can hear you okay, Claudia.
Oh, thank you. Can you see me?
No, is your video on?
I hope so. I'm sorry. I don't have any experience with Meet.
That's okay. There should be a camera button up top where you can turn it on.
I'm trying to find it. Just
Hey.
Hello.
Okay. We have some time before you need to go. So we can get started soon. There you are. Hi. Thank you so much for joining us. Sigrun, let's try one more time. Yes. All right, welcome everybody to our book launch of the book Resistance to Repression and Violence, Global Psychological Perspectives. I'm Fouad Bou Zeineddine, and I'm so happy to welcome you to this event. Unfortunately, as some of you might know, our presenter Clara Tristakova was not able to be with us today due to illness. Unfortunately, but hopefully we will have even more time with the speakers who are available and for discussion and Q&A. I will talk a little bit about the book and the scope of the book, the motivations for the book, and Johanna will say a few words as well, and then we will move to our first speaker, Reem Saab. Dr. Reem Saab is a lecturer in psychology at the University of Sussex. After that, we will have Professor Sigrun Moss, a professor at University of Oslo. And then we will have Dr. Claudia Zuniga, professor of social psychology at the University of Chile. Okay, just one last quick check if everything is clear in terms of the presentation. You can see the slides okay?
yeah, perfectly. Thanks.
Lovely. All right, so Resistance to Repression and Violence, Global Psychological Perspectives. I wish I could say I was happy about having had to write this book. In my point of view, it is important, it is valuable. I'm happy that it's done, but I'm a bit upset and angry that this kind of book has not come before. There's very, very little psychological research on resistance in repressive and violent contexts. And as we will talk about in our presentations today, as you will see, this has relevance not just for those contexts, but also for our understanding of resistance and repression everywhere. So why this book and why now? This book has been 3 years in the making. Obviously, some of the chapters in it are already out of date. The events have been very, very fast moving in a lot of the contexts in which we have research presented in this book, whether that's the chapters on Lebanon, on Palestine, on Sudan, or even on the Philippines, and other contexts as well. In all of these different contexts, the things that we were talking about in the chapters are still relevant, and we can draw lessons in terms of what we were able to see in those chapters for what's happening now. But of course, as we will discuss, resistance strategies, our interaction and our handling of repressive strategies will differ depending on the course of events. And the course of events has been going to increased repression and increased violence and increased ethnic cleansing and increased genocide and increased oppression of all sorts. Does this actually change whether people resist? The answer is a clear no. You don't need psychologists to tell you that people will resist being oppressed, regardless of how repressive and violent the contexts are. And you will see in some of the chapters in this book as well that even in situations of genocide, as there was in Rwanda or as there was in the Holocaust, people will continue to resist, and they will continue to resist in every possible means and method that they have at their disposal. The book is timely, I guess. Repression and violence and disregard for human rights and dignity are on the rise. And it's important to understand how people psychologically and behaviorally sustain and adapt their challenges to oppression under these increasingly common and in some contexts, long-standing and chronic circumstances. The book covers a gap in the literature on resistance and collective action in such contexts. The previous work has been very, very highly focused on developed countries and on protest as a resistance strategy. We can only triangulate the importance of context to the psychology of resistance to oppression if there's sufficient breadth and diversity available in the literature that we have. Unfortunately, that literature was very, very scarce before we started working on this book. Luckily, that has improved somewhat, and there's quite a bit more research coming out now out of the global majority that is starting to recognize the importance of understanding the interplay between repression and resistance, and not just for countries that are particularly repressive, but also for countries that were previously thought to be not so repressive. The book also covers a gap in the range of resistance study. Previous work highly focused on protest, and we couldn't really understand how people adapted to repression and violence if we only looked at the range of overt and sensational political and military activity that people engage in these settings, where protest can be more structurally constrained and repressed. By expanding that view, understanding all the ways in which people resist and all the ways in which people's resistance is repressed, we can start answering some more theoretical questions about how people try to empower themselves and how people try to adapt to dominance and hegemony and oppression. This, in turn, allows us to understand repression and oppression better, enabling us to study the various hegemonies and seeing more formalized and normalized analogs of this kind of repression in managerial democracies as well, whether that's in the West or elsewhere. So one of the goals with this book was to foster links and generate dialogue and academic and experiential exchange between people who are working in different contexts and time periods who normally might not have been exposed to each other. And it underscores the value of the research area and to the discipline of underrepresented voices and work in the so-called periphery. Another goal was to emphasize with empirical evidence how resistance as a phenomenon is pervasive, varied in its forms and goals, and responsive and resilient to repressive tactics. situated in and inseparable from history, politics, social relations and interactions, as well as being informed by individual differences in psychological processes. So in our book, we covered quite a few contexts in a variety of different themes. In the first section of the book, we focused on what is typically examined in the field, the psychology of protest. But we put together 5 amazing chapters on protest in violent and repressive contexts where this kind of work is less common. In the second section, we looked at resistance off the streets, the psychology of resistance strategies beyond protest, whether that's in cultural resistance or in diaspora resistance, digital resistance, individual resistance, and all sorts of other ways in which people have resisted in various contexts. In the third section, we looked at the dynamics, the interplay between the repressive the repressive strategies and the resistance strategies that people have, looking at how context influences those dynamics, looking at the timeline of resistance, for example, in Sudan that Professor Moss will talk to us about today. Perhaps we looked also at how multiple parties and multiple factors are involved in the context of Palestinian resistance. We looked at dynamics of leadership and resistance in historical cases as well, in the Czechoslovak Republic, as well as in modern electoral politics. Generally, resistance is seen as perhaps something that happens outside of electoral politics or outside of institutional politics. But actually, we have some very good arguments here from Dr. Montiel and colleagues saying that resistance happens everywhere, not just in the streets or in culture, but also in the politics themselves. And of course, we have a chapter as well, another historical context looking at how bystanders or intermediate groups get influenced and whether they stand in solidarity with those who are being oppressed and resisting or are kept away from doing so, and what that means psychologically for those in those situations. So what do we conclude out of this book? I'm going to talk a little bit more than I expected to because of our one less speaker. Hopefully, some of the conclusions that I'm deriving here are helpful and will set the stage for our speakers as well. So in terms of repression, what did we find out? Blatant political repression overall does not seem to lead to lasting suppression of resistance. What it does instead, it tends to diversify, causes resistance movements to innovate and change. And what it also does is it changes the subjective experience and moral processing of what resistance is and what it means to people engaging in it. The repression of overt and organized movements and elites is ineffective when done on its own. Reason being that resistance doesn't always happen in a planned, organized, and deliberate kind of way. It can be emotive, it can be opportunistic, or it can be spontaneous in ways that are difficult to repress simply by focusing on the overt and organized. Centralized leadership is not necessary, but it can facilitate movements in terms of their success and their ability to achieve their goals. And distributed leadership is not leaderlessness. There are lots of examples in our book of resistance movements that are not centrally led. That doesn't mean they're less effective. That doesn't mean that they're leaderless. What it means is that they're differently structured and differently organized, have different strengths and different weaknesses compared to those that are more centrally hierarchical. And repression comes in many forms, including covert, collective, informational, systemic, and cultural. And we know very little about these forms of repression in terms of their psychological underpinnings, in terms of the behaviors that elites are engaging in terms of the collective action that elites are engaging in. We know very little about their efforts in these directions. As for resistance, we see that resistance and repression works in networks. It's found in formal and informal politics. There's spillover in every social domain, including in body politics and cyberspace. And any one instance of resistance or repression doesn't exist in isolation from other repressions and other resistances. There are links and interdependencies and solidarities that exist between repressive agents and their networks and between resistance agents and their networks. Within resistance networks, what we find is that resistance is internally diverse, it's coalitional. There is no such thing as a resistance movement with a particular goal and a particular cause, and every follower of that resistance movement believing in exactly the same thing for the same reasons. There are different tactics that feed off of each other and off dynamics within these resistance groups that determine how the group as a whole ends up emerging to respond to repressive strategies and to the history of the resistance and what's happened in the past in their efforts to resist. Individual choice is only part of the answer, and potentially this is less so the case the more severe the repression. So people tend to pick resistance strategies more freely and more individually the less repressive things are. The more repressive things are, the more narrow those options tend to be, and the more socially determined those response options tend to be, and the more collective and the more communal they have to be. And because of that, you also see less choice in terms of the strategies that you may pick from, or that are anchored in your mind. If everybody around us is involved in a particular form of resistance, this is going to be the form that we are most likely to engage in, regardless of whether we are individually predisposed or not, particularly if this seems to be the only thing that people around us are collectively cohering around, because you want to be pushing forward with the group rather than working against or working on your own outside the group. So social context and interdependence are key in how tactics are figured out. Resistance, as you might expect, is influenced by both pre-existing and emerging social hierarchies and organization. Political resistance is situated in broader social hierarchies, even when those resistance movements are not per se about those hierarchies. So, for example, in the chapter by Montiel and colleagues on the resistance in the Philippines to electoral authoritarianism, we saw that there was a massive intersection between the fight against authoritarianism and the fight against sexism in Philippine elections. Leadership dynamics and the organizational sociology of elite power structures, the informational advantages that elites have, their ability to coordinate better than us, their ability to set up institutions that then take on a life and power of their own in controlling resistance. The norms that can be used and the institutions that can be used can all be used to support or to suppress resistance. So the question isn't, let's just eliminate every institution or let's just eliminate every tool of oppression. They are tools. They do what we tell them to do. We can set them up in such ways as they work for resistance or for empowering political projects rather than for oppressive or repressive strategies. Activism, leadership, and organization can emerge organically from resistance. There doesn't have to be a preset or prefigured set of groups or organization to begin a wave of resistance. That resistance can start through everyday interaction between activists, between leaders, between organizations. In terms of the motives for resistance, resistance in general we see as an adaptive and pervasive and emergent motivation under repression and oppression. It's often embedded in and constructed by a series of motivational and outcome trade-offs. Sometimes there are multiple opposing motivations and goals incentivized by the culture. Do I protect myself, or do I engage in the defense of the group? So sometimes those two goals are contradictory. What do you choose? A single person is going to choose something different at any given moment of time. It is not about necessarily the individual differences, the personality traits, the characteristics of the person, so much as it is the person in their moment of time and in the context that that time point is embedded in, and in what's happening in their social networks around them that seems to be more important in getting people to figure out these trade-offs and make decisions about where they want to be in terms of what they want to lose and what they want to gain. Resistance and resilience are both context dependent, and in our studies in this book, we can see that they can often be conceptually overlapping. What is good for me to be able to sustain myself and be persistent and committed to my resistance, I need to be able to fight off some repression, particularly in repressive contexts, right? So just to be able to continue my activist status in some contexts is an act of resistance. In some contexts, just continuing to exist is an act of resistance, especially when the repressor or repressor is aiming for your elimination and your cleansing. In some other cases, resistance and resilience are actually distinct and can oppose each other. What is good for me to be, to continue and to survive and to persist might not be the best thing for the group. I'd have to consider situations where self-sacrifice is called. Resistance can also be leveraged, used, or supported for various purposes, not just necessarily the cause or the goal, the main goal of the resistance movement, but also including things like wanting to establish coalitional solidarity. So there's a faction that believes that engaging in protests helps. I don't necessarily believe it, but I'm going to do it anyway because they're part of the movement, and everything that anybody is doing to raise awareness of the issue and be active in fighting back is good enough. So for coalitional solidarity, sure, sometimes opportunistic politics, something happens where suddenly protest seems a lot more effective because there's a power vacuum, for example. In terms of tactics, there's an immense variety in resistance repertoires. Not going to go through all of it right now. The book is quite rich in the kinds of tactics that people have talked about in examples. The tactical preferences that people have for specific resistance strategies are themselves not fixed, but responsive to change. Changes in the circumstances of the resistance movement, changes in the resistance itself. So what's going on internally in that resistance and the power struggles and the politics within a resistance strategy. And pre-existing characteristics and changes in the personal and social circumstances of the participants, including the kinds of socialization and relationships and family histories that people have. What we see is that eclecticism, the openness to lots of different tactics in resistance, is not just a nothing to lose effect where people just say, let's do whatever it takes, it doesn't matter, we have nothing to lose. It can also be opportunistic. It can also be strategic. So if we're doing lots and lots of different things, if we're protesting, if we're petitioning, if we're raising legal cases, if we're doing boycotts, all at the same time, this serves a strategic purpose to confuse and overwhelm authorities with the different strategies that are being used. And this has been used effectively in the past, for example, in Sudan. And eclecticism can also be reflective of intra-group heterogeneity and tolerance. So yes, we acknowledge that in our resistance movement, there are a variety of positions. There's a more radical faction and there's a more centrist faction. This faction between the radical factions, there's a faction that believes in violent resistance. There's a faction that believes in prefigurative resistance. But there's this common sense that we need to act in concert, that we need to support each other. So even if I don't particularly believe in the tactics that a faction of my resistance movement is engaging in, I might still support them for the good of the group. Okay, I'm going to stop there and hand over to Johanna for any other comments or notes that you might have about the book that I might have missed, and then we can continue with our speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Fouad. I don't think you missed anything. That was very thorough, very complete. So let's start with the presentations.
Okay, great. So I will share this again.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being here with us today. First of all, I would like to thank Fouad for organizing this event, and also both Fouad and Johanna for the opportunity to contribute to this book. And I'd also like to express my appreciation of the process that was followed in writing this book, because I think there was quite an original process in terms of attempts to do community building. You know, we had these regular talks that united the different contributors, and this community building exercise is still ongoing. So yeah, I think it's a great process. So thank you also for that. I contributed a couple of chapters to the book, and today I'm going to focus on one of them, where my co-authors and I developed a model on the social psychological dynamics of repression and resistance repression. Now, this chapter tried to get inspiration from the social psychological literature on collective action, and also our lived experience as co-authors of the October 2019 Lebanese uprising. And I'd like to mention my co-authors are Arin Ayanya, Aya Adra, and Vivian Badhan. So what I'm going to do today is talk to you about the model. However, I'm not going to talk about how it applies to the 2019 uprising context. And the reason is, as Fouad has mentioned earlier on, that today in Lebanon, we have entered a very different historical phase, so that you know, talking about that period seems quite outdated and not really befitting for the present moment. We have an ongoing Israeli colonial genocide, continuing expansion of the Israeli colonial project, and a brutal Israeli war going on Lebanon with basically daily war crimes. We are also, of course, living all this with the knowledge of the responsibility and the complicity of Western powers and Western institutions, including academic institutions that we work with. Over the last year, we have witnessed an unprecedented global solidarity movement with Palestine, accompanied by, of course, a lot of repression as well as counter-repression. And so with this context in mind, it only seemed appropriate in an event about violence, repression, and resistance to repression that we should talk about the present moment. And for this reason, what I'm going to do today is present the model and then try and offer some initial reflections on how this model might help us to maybe make sense of the some of the repression and counter-repression dynamics that we are witnessing today in the context of solidarity activism with Palestine, particularly in Western countries. So the starting point of the model is the literature on the antecedents of collective action. So, we start with this simple idea that collective action is more likely to happen when the social psychological motivators of collective action are high, they're activated, and the inhibitors of collective action are low. I'm going to talk in a bit about what these motivators and inhibitors are, but that's what we call the social psychological capital of collective action. So this is an attempt to talk about some of the main antecedents of collective action according to the literature, and I walk you through them. So according to the social psychological literature, people are more likely to partake in collective action when they perceive an injustice, a collective injustice against a group they identify with, which they blame on an outgroup. The role of emotions is, of course, important. So collective action is more likely to happen when people experience anger or moral outrage. The role of fear is important. Fouad mentioned how fear has some kind of contradictory results. We are assuming here that it might be easier for people to engage in collective action when they are able to manage their fear. Efficacy consideration and group morale are also important, right? People are more likely to engage in collective action the higher their group morale is, presumably. Also, the more they identify with the social movement. So, the more unity, the more solidarity, the more trust there is within the social movement, the more likely people are to partake in collective action. Moral considerations also play an important role, particularly a felt inner moral obligation to take action. And this is particularly important in repressive contexts where engaging in collective action might be very costly. And so being grounded in the moral obligation to take action becomes really valuable. Social networks, as Fouad mentioned, are also very important. So being embedded in supportive social networks. And finally, there's also literature on the, the cost-benefit analysis side of things. So experiencing personal rewards from participating in collective action is important when it comes to risks or costs. So risks to safety, to life, to livelihood, etc. The more one can manage these costs, the more likely people are to engage in collective action. Sometimes these costs are very high, but people are also manage them by reappraising the perceived importance of these costs as well. So, so with this in mind, the idea of the model is that for repression to be effective in undermining collective action, repression has to undermine these antecedents of collective action. So reduce the motivators and heighten the inhibitors. So, for example, repression has to undermine perceptions of injustice, right? And through that, it may undermine the incentives to engage in collective action. So where does counter-repression come in? For counter-repression to be effective, it would be helpful, according to our proposition in this model, for activists to understand which social psychological antecedents of collective action are being targeted, right? And once we understand how this social psychological capital of collective action is being targeted, we can also think of ways in which we can preserve, maintain, or restore these threatened antecedents of collective action. For example, if repression is hiding the injustice that is affecting the group, counter-repression would consist more of exposing the injustice. Right, so this is, the basic idea of the model. So with this in mind, let's look at, I'll just offer some reflections on how this applies to the current context of solidarity activism with Palestine, drawing on examples of repression around us and examples of counter-repression as well. So with regards to undermining the legitimacy of the cause and identification with the movement, we see attempts to control the narrative by denying, obscuring, and hiding Palestinian oppression on one hand, and on the other hand, we see attempts to heighten perceptions of Israeli victimhood, so alter the perceived power dynamics of who's the oppressor and who is the oppressed. This delegitimization can be visible through the processes of stigmatization and criminalization of solidarity activism with Palestine. And we see this, for example, through accusations of anti-Semitism and also through accusations of support for terrorism. So together, these processes serve to undermine the legitimacy of the cause, but also trust in the movement and the potential of identifying with the movement and thereby engaging in solidarity. So how do we see, what are some examples in which activists are trying to counter this process? For example, the visible and vocal engagement of Jewish activist groups and networks in pro-Palestine solidarity also serves to counter this accusation of anti-Semitism and really to distinguish between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. In terms of undermining identification with the movement, we see, of course, banning and criminalizing the display of identity symbols like the Palestinian flag or Palestinian clothing, the kufiya, or other political symbols. You can see this, for example, happening with pupils in schools or teaching staff. And attempts to counter this have taken various forms, such as collectively defying bans to challenge legitimacy of these restrictions and complicate the enforcement of these restrictions. We've also seen circumvention of these bans through the adoption of alternative symbols. A very simple example is the adoption of the watermelon as an alternative symbol. In terms of undermining efficacy, we see various repressive attempts to undermine the capacity to resist through the basic outlawing of solidarity activism. We can see this in various ways. For example, the adoption of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which has happened in various Western countries and across many higher education institutions in the UK. And this is essentially a definition that equates criticism of Israeli policies, that equates anti-Zionism and decolonial perspectives on Palestine with anti-Semitism. We've seen attempts to criminalize protest chants or slogans like "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." We've seen also attempts to pass laws to prohibit the right to boycott, for example, as an attack on the BDS movement. And of course, the use of counterterrorism laws and measures to silence pro-Palestine solidarity activism, and that includes the Prevent Counterterrorism program. Incidentally, I was, I was sent a list of what is okay and what is not okay for me to say at this event before coming to this talk. So, you can see these restrictions on freedom of speech happening in, all around us. So what does restoring efficacy consist of? Restoring capacity to resist through protecting the legality of solidarity activism. So we see, even before October 7th, that various higher education institutions have successfully rejected the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. We've seen more recently the use of legal recourse to, for example, establish anti-Zionism as a protective belief under the equality law here in the UK. That was a few weeks ago with a landmark court ruling. We've also seen, for example, in the Netherlands, the assertion of the legality of slogans like "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." In the UK, we've seen public pressure against the anti-boycott bill, and prior to the recent elections, the bill actually ended up getting shelved. Restoring efficacy also takes the form of preserving pressure through more radical means. For example, groups like Palestine Action, beyond these laws that are trying to outlaw boycott, these groups are engaging in direct action on weapons manufacturers like Elbit, for example, to try and shut them down. Undermining efficacy also involves undermining the capacity and resources for resisting through the restriction of civic space, for example, the banning of protests, but also deplatforming. That happens offline, for example, canceling events, banning speakers, threatening legal action against venues that host speakers or event organizers. It also happens online. with censorship on social media, very visibly on Meta, but also on X, YouTube, Google, censoring posts, shadow banning, suspending accounts, and so on. And we also see that with restrictions of funding, like freezing bank accounts of activist groups and cutting donor funding to Palestinian organizations. So preserving efficacy here has meant trying to preserve civic space and countering deplatforming. This takes the several forms like defying protest bans, but also circumventing online censorship through the use of what is known as algospeak, right? So a special language that bypasses algorithms. Also circumventing the cancellation of events by switching events online. Finally, of course, repression functions through heightening the cost of engaging in solidarity activism. We've seen threats of freedom and safety like arrests, detention, violence by police, but also by counter-protesters, threats of deportation for migrants. We've seen threats to reputation and social stigmatization like doxing, threats to livelihood and professional careers like economic repression has been one of the main forms that we have seen, people's jobs being threatened. People losing their jobs, but we've also seen this with students whereby their education is threatened, they get suspended from university, there are threats to their graduation, and so on. So countering this has also taken several forms. For example, managing threats of freedom and safety has happened through public pressure to release people from arrests or detention, or dropping charges against them, crowdfunding to help them with legal costs, increased digital media security measures to help with doxing, public pressure against job dismissal or disciplinary measures against students. For example, we've seen statements and petitions by high-profile figures, people resigning in solidarity with others who lost their jobs. And we've also seen retaliation against institutions that have used disciplinary measures, for example, boycotting institutions that have used severe disciplinary measures against students that have engaged in solidarity activism. So these are basically just some initial reflections on how this model can be applied to make better sense of repression and counter-repression mechanisms. So what can we conclude from all this? It's obviously not an exhaustive list of repression and counter-repression measures. There's so much more that can be said. Also, there is lots to be said about how this model applies in other contexts, including, for example, anti-Zionist resistance in Palestine, Lebanon, and other Arab countries. And that's it for me. Thank you.
No, it's okay. Okay, up next we have Sigrun.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. My other computer wasn't really working, so I've run over to a seminar room. Let me see if I can now manage to share this. Oh, this is not great. Teams does not like me.
Sorry about.
Okay, there we go. Can you see this?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much, Fouad, for inviting me to this, and to you, Johanna and Fouad, for your work on the book. And thank you so much, Reem, for your important presentation. That was really interesting. And thank you all for being here, both online and people in the room. So my name is Sigrun Mariemos. I'm a professor at the University of Oslo here in Norway. And I want to talk to you today about a book chapter that I contributed to this book with my lovely colleague, Ubay, who is Sudanese. He can't be with us today, but he passes on greetings. And before I start talking about this chapter, which is about the analysis of the lead up to the revolution in Sudan, we really wanted to acknowledge the horrors on the ground in Sudan, which has been brutal for years and years, but particularly brutal since April 23. There's a power struggle between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces, which then erupted into a large-scale conflict in April 23, and which has been, causing havoc on the country ever since. A new study has come out that shows the number of people that has died due to the war in Sudan is likely far higher than previous estimates. So it was released on Wednesday last week by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. There's Sudan.
Sigrun, sorry to interrupt. We only see your PowerPoint window. We don't see the full view slide.
Okay, let me see. Because I see the full slide. What about now?
Yeah, it's still just the program. If you share the different window, if you share the full screen version, it should do it.
Well, I tried that, but it didn't really work. Let's try again. Let me try to do this. Because it was showing up for me. Let's see. So you couldn't see it at all?
We could just see the Microsoft, not the full view, not the presenter view.
Well, it's not wanting to collaborate with me here. Let's see.
If you send slides, I can show them from here.
Okay, let me do that quickly.
Yeah.
Okay, Fouad, then I have sent. Them to you. Okay, so hopefully that will work. Okay, so Fouad, whilst you find those and try to share those, let me just finish what I wanted to say about this new report that says that more than 60,000 people have died in the Khartoum region alone during the first 14 months of the war. And some estimates puts the death toll in Sudan as large as around 150,000 people since April 2023. And the violence has pushed around 11 million people away from their homes, and is there now in one of the world's biggest hunger crisis, where nearly 25 million people, half of Sudan's population, need aid. Did you receive it, Fouad?
No, sorry.
Okay, I'll just continue a little bit and hopefully it will come soon. So what Ubay and I wanted to focus on in this chapter that we wrote up is the role of history in understanding psychology of resistance, where resistance, if we look at it as kind of struggles grounded in the perceived wrongs in the past and present and vying for a different future, it's of course very temporal. There is something about what is present and what is to come and what has been. So we wanted to focus on this more hopeful phase in Sudan, where we saw processes of people's power in 2018 and the revolution, and we wanted to understand the revolution better. And scholars have urged psychology to attend more to history, which is also key to understanding the psychology of resistance. And we have a tendency in psychology to think about collective action more like the event in itself. We look at the big protests that happened, or we look at the big revolution that took place, but we then often ignore what came before, but also what comes after. Still nothing, Fouad?
No, sorry. Maybe try sharing it again from yours, but
That's really frustrating. Okay, let's see if this works now.
got it.
Okay, perfect. Very good. So will you share it with us online as well so that we can see it? Okay, perfect. So if you move to the third slide, what? Okay, so as I was mentioning, we often think about these large-scale protests or things as very kind of isolated events. But then that, okay, now it's just moving. So as I mentioned, we then kind of forego of what came before and what comes after. And in this chapter, we're trying to focus on what came before. That is not an indication that we don't care about what comes after revolution or large-scale protests. So I included some references for important papers that focuses on the after, but in this chapter, we limited our focus to then look at what comes before large-scale protest or revolution. So if we can have the next slide. So we call here for expanding the timeline of resistance in research on the psychology of resistance. And if you click again, Taylor has emphasized that we should not forget that what we often refer to as new social movements is often merely kind of carryovers from previous resistance. It does not kind of come out of nothing. And Friul Bilali has a really interesting paper on resistant movements learning from history, and that these historical narratives of the past inform choices on future resistance, and these historical narratives can be mobilized. And we also think it's important to study other forms of resistance than just protests, these everyday resistance, which the book is full of examples of, because when we do look at just the case of these large-scale protests, we often miss out on focusing on more of these everyday protests and situations. So we then turn to the Sudan revolution from 2018. The country up until then was run by al-Bashir, who gained control in a coup in 1989. And they then initiated a revolution in December 2018. And a lot of the coverage of this was focusing on how sudden this was and how surprising the revolution was and how unexpected it was. But then many Sudanese did not refer to it as very surprising. So for example, Guta writes that the 2018-19 revolution was not spontaneous, but rather the climax of the 30 years of resistance against Sudan's dictatorship. And we saw a lot of those narratives in terms of people saying on the ground, it wasn't surprising because they were emphasizing what came before the long process that kind of led up to this revolution. So we discussed Sudanese perceptions of this resistance as more long-term and anticipated. And then we wanted in our chapter to emphasize the need for expanding this timeline of resistance to explore this build-up. So we're here in the chapter, we focus on the build-up to the revolution, and we focus on 3 selected processes to understand this kind of before, in terms what then enabled the revolution in 2018. So one of the 3 things that we focused on is that the Sudanese were seeing themselves as being experienced in people's power. So they have ousted military regimes twice before, in 64 and 85, and this was often brought up. We have done this. There was a historical narrative around the fact that we as Sudanese, we have done this twice before. We know how to overturn governments. We're just, building up and waiting, it will come. If you click the next one, Fouad. So for example, about the 64 revolution, Jock says, this was the first popular northern revolution since independence, and a source of pride and often invoked by the Sudanese. So you could see people kind of mentioning this, and Ubay and others who then participated in the revolution emphasizes that these previous uprisings motivated people in the 2018 revolution. The second aspect we focused on in the chapter is focused on the repressors, also learning from history, so that you see the resistance movement learning from what happened in the past and then adjusting their tactics. But importantly, these repressive regimes also learn from past resistance and adjust their kind of demobilization accordingly. So the al-Bashir government, for example, just after the coup in 1989, they removed key forces behind earlier uprisings. So they dissolved parliament, they outlawed trade unions and political parties, arrested opposition, closed media, etc. And we're saying that we will go from power to the grave. We will try everything in our book to learn from what worked for them previously so that they will not be able to overthrow us. If you take the next 2 ones and one more, yeah. And then they also, if you go back one, Fouad, they also had a tamkeen policy, which is an empowerment policy where they actively purged the system of disloyal career bureaucrats. So those perceived to be anti-regime, to make sure they only had as many loyal supporters as possible. So estimates say that between 1989 and 2001, 73,640 government employees were dismissed over then accusations of being non-loyal to the government. The third aspect that we discuss in the chapter is this process of increasing resistance. And then many Sudanese were talking about, it wasn't just the revolution in 2018 that started earlier, and many talk about protests around 2010 when the Arab Spring was ongoing, and where Bashir said in a statement, they talk of an Arab Spring. Let me tell them that in Sudan, we have a hot summer, a burning hot summer that burns its enemies. So there was demobilization of the uprisings then. They also had violent demobilizations of protests, new rounds of protests in 2013. And in 2013, they initiated what has been talked about as neighborhood resistance committees, which were cells to mobilize protests, which then proved very useful in later processes, where there wasn't just one big demonstration going on where everybody gathered, which may be easier to strike down on, but there were various little cells of mobilization that was closer to people's homes. It was more difficult for security forces to strike down on it, etc. And then El Gisuli says in 2020 that the September 2013 protest had been in many respects a rehearsal for the December 2018 showdown. In 2016, they had general strikes that I've also been mentioning as very important aspects that were put in place that they could later use in 2018 when they needed to, different ways of sharing communications, for example. So all these and many other episodes and processes crafted out kind of tactics or civil spaces and unity that were then repertoire they could lean on later. So we think that this chapter has several contributions, that it's important that we remember that these resistance movements often learn from history, build on movements that are already in place, but as does these repressive regimes, and that both sides are building repertoires. And through focusing on this longer lines, the timeline of resistance, we think that the kind of stamina of the movement and the learning processes and the longer duration of the resistance is more evident compared to if we're not tracking these more extended lines of the protests. So it's crucial, basically, to expand our timeline that we often focus on, both before but also after, like some of these other texts I mentioned earlier have done, because it also allows for more of this everyday resistance that we more often kind of lose track of in our studies of the psychology of resistance. Thank you, and sorry for the technical issues.
Thank you so much, Sigrun. Sorry about the technical issues on my side. Okay, Claudia.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah, thank you. It's a real challenge. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be with you today. Well, I'd be happier if I were there with you, but anyway, no, seriously, it is an honor for me to participate in the launch of this book. I'm grateful to the University of Greenwich Center for Inequalities for organizing this event and providing us with the opportunity to come together, even virtually, to discuss and reflect on how people resist oppression and repression. I would like to begin by congratulating the editors and author for the tremendous effort you have put into this project, which addresses issues of the utmost relevance and urgency in today's world. And I want to especially thank Ring and Sigrun for their compelling talks. I know we feel really touched and worried about what you are talking about, but we need to do that. I am convinced that this book is a major contribution to the field. Today, the focus is on psychology, but it can be a reference text for many disciplines, such as history, sociology, political science, journalism, ethics, and human rights, and many others. It offers a comprehensive and well-researched collection of works on a wide range of contexts, periods, and issues, presenting innovative theoretical insight, but it also has the potential to engage a wider audience through its emphasis on the practical implication of each work. And as the news makes clear every day, these are not issues that need to be studied only in authoritarian contexts or very young democracies, as abuse of power and police brutality can happen anywhere. It is evident that an understanding of the historical, social, and political context is fundamental to the comprehension of the dynamic of resistance to repression and oppression. However, this is not always apparent in published work, which often appears to be carried out in a vacuum. A similar observation we can make regarding the necessity to integrate the macro, meso, and micro domains in order to study and understand such complex phenomena. This is also absent from the literature prior to this book. So I'm really think this book is fundamental in emphasizing this point. I'm a researcher on social protest and social movement in Latin America. And it is from this perspective and experience that I hope to contribute to the dialogue by offering some reflection and comments on the research and theory presented in this volume. This book makes clear that there is a notable inconsistency in the finding of studies examining the relationship between repression and protest. This discrepancy is so remarkable that it was called the punishment puzzle by Davenport and the protest repression nexus by Lischbach. And just a curious fact, I can tell you that to address this knowledge gap, we conducted a systematic literature review to assess the relationship between repression and participation in collective actions. And we found 216 research articles published between 1981 and 2020. And we found a growing trend in the number of articles published, and that most studies are carried out. I'm sorry, I have a dog trying to get into the room. Sorry about that. Yes, I was saying that the most studies I carry out from a microsocial or structural perspective to the detriment of psychosocial studies. And on the relationship between repression and collective action, preliminary analysis showed that 2 studies found no relationship, 89 found a positive one, 58 a negative one, and 42 a nonlinear relationship or mixed results. The first glances at the data have not allowed us to identify possible moderators to explain this difference, and the operational definitions of the variables are so diverse that we don't know whether it will be possible to do a meta-analysis. So I hope the next time we meet, I will be able to tell you more. For the moment, we have been studying the relationship between repression and collective action from a psychosocial perspective in Latin American countries. As you probably know, in recent years, we have observed a wave of social unrest in the region. Between 2019 and 2021, Latin America was shaken by a wave of massive protests that made evident a growing popular discontent that does not seem to differentiate territories or ideologies. And the response of the authorities, instead of diminishing the intensity of the protest, contributed to their escalation. We have studied the cases of Ecuador, Peru, Chile, and Colombia, where there were massive protests that were heavily repressed. We have selected university students as the target population because they have had a relevant participation in the social movement of each country studied, and also because they constitute a more comparable population. We measure perception of repression, operationalized as how likely the participant thought it was that a person taking part in social protests in their country will be identified by the police, injured by the police, or detained or arrested. And we found that in every country, more than 80% of participants thought it was likely or very likely that someone will be injured or arrested for taking part in protests. And we're talking about democratic contexts where the right to freedom of or expression and assembly are supposed to be guaranteed. Some of the most interesting results we have found are that the perception of repression has an indirect positive effect on repression, on participation and collective action, both via anger and via collective efficacy. On the one hand, perception of repression increased anger, and this in turn increased participation in collective actions, both directly and via social identification. On the other hand, perception of repression has a positive effect on the perception of collective efficacy, that increasing the willingness to participate in collective action, also both directly and via social identification. We did not expect this result, but it's consistent with what has been reported in several chapters of this book. Qualitative research we conducted in Chile suggests that one possible explanation for this is that participants infer that if the government has to suppress protests so much, it is because the government is afraid of the protest. And that must mean that the social movements are a threat to the status quo. So repression could be an indication that protests have the potential to promote the changes that are desired. But of course, we need more research on this specific issue. In addition to perception of repression, we measure direct and indirect experience of repression, and we operationalize direct experience as whether the participant has been identified, detained, or injured for taking part in protests, are an indirect experience as whether family members, friends, or acquaintances had been detained, injured, or identified by the police for taking part in protests. And using nonlinear models, we found two distinct patterns in how the experience of repression affects participation in collective action. It seems that direct experience of repression has a positive effect on participation. In other words, the more people have experienced repression firsthand, for example, if they have been identified, detained, or injured, the more likely they are to take part in protests. On the other hand, an indirect experience of repression has an inverted U-shaped effect on participation. When people have low or moderate levels of indirect experience, like when family members or friends are repressed, they are more likely to take part in protests. However, when a certain level is reached, higher levels of indirect experience led to lower participation. See? Regarding direct experience of repression, one possible explanation for this result is that since these are cross-sectional studies, we can rule out the possibility that people who participate more often are simply more likely to be repressed. We have data from a 3-wave longitudinal study, but we haven't been able to look at it yet. One of the pros and cons of living in such a terrible continent is that we can produce more data than we can analyze it. But there might also be more fundamental reason, such as the one you have mentioned before, and we have lots of examples in the book. Now, when it comes to the nonlinear effect of indirect experience of repression, there could be an initial solidarity and empathy phenomenon. This is when knowing close people who have been repressed can generate feeling of solidarity and a motivation to support the cause, increasing participation. It might also mean having more information about the risks involved in getting involved. At first, this can make people more aware of how serious the situation is and why they should take action. And the same factor could also explain the deterrent effect at high levels, since once you have surpassed a certain threshold, the accumulation of cases of repression in your close environment could increase fear and risk perception. It is also possible that emotional fatigue and hopelessness might set in, as high level of repression in one's social circle can lead to feeling of exhaustion and helplessness, which might make it less appealing to get involved. We recently conducted a qualitative study with young people who took part in the Chilean urban revolt, and we discovered that the majority of participants had experienced what has been labeled protester burnout, as Ayani, Tash, and Saab mentioned in their chapter. They report they feel tired and overwhelmed by the intensity of the protest, the personal cost of violence, how it polarized society, and the lack of tangible results from the movement. I just want to reiterate that we're carried out these studies in democratic contexts. These results show that in this context, police repression of collective action may lead to greater protest, violence, and radicalization. So it seems that on applied level, political leaders and government security agents need to be trained to improve their ability to allow freedom of expression and peaceful demonstration. Finally, if I may, I would like to ask some questions to the author. I can ask each of you one question to allow time for the audience to ask their own question. And I can then ask some more if there is time. So, Turim, your chapter mentions how the dynamic of repression and counter-repression can vary between different social or geographical subgroups we live in. I just was wondering if you could elaborate on any notable difference in strategies or outcomes when examining these dynamics through an intersectional or localized lens. To Sigrun, well, I have to admit that I'm very impressed with your work, and I can't help but think of the risk you must have taken. So I would like to ask you, as a foreign woman conducting research in Sudan, how did your position as both an outsider and a female researcher shape your access to participants, the type of narrative you encounter, and the overall dynamic of your fieldwork? Were there specific challenges or opportunities tied to these intersecting identities? That's for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to open it up to the speakers to respond to Claudia's questions, and then after that we will take questions through the Q&A online. Reem, would you like to go first?
Sure. Do I answer?
Just
It will be a short answer anyway. Hello, Claudia. How are you? Thank you so much for your insights and comments, and also sharing these fascinating findings. With regards to your question, I'm wondering as well how much it will make sense to others to for me to answer this question, because I did not, address the specifics of the context that we discussed in the book chapter in my presentation today. And it struck me as you ask your question, is that I feel like, we submitted this book chapter in summer 2023, and it seems like such a long time ago, right? And what we were thinking back then, considering the difference with the present context. Anyway, these were just I'm just sharing my initial feelings about, even the question that came out, and, what was I thinking when I wrote this, when we wrote this chapter. So you asked about how repression and counter-repression might differ depending on geographic locations, because we make that point, right, during the Lebanese uprising. And the idea there was that different parts of Lebanon had, they had different political parties that were stronger or weaker in these different areas, right? And so the repression that you witness in different areas might have taken different forms, right? So it wasn't necessarily the same forms of repression that we saw throughout the country, and therefore the forms of counter-repression could have differed as well. And so what we were just referring to in that part of the chapter was to say that, when thinking about repression and counter-repression, we might need to go into just more localized geographic units of analysis, right? Rather than just analyze how repression might take place in the whole of the nation state, right? Because repression can take place by state actors, but also non-state actors, and these non-state actors might differ across the nation state. Does that make sense? No.
Sorry. I have missed the microphone. Yeah, thank you so much. Really, I was thinking exactly the same. How can you see that today? So really, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sigrun, did you want to respond to this question?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Claudia, and thank you for your presentation. That was very interesting indeed. Thank you for that question on the process of doing the research. For this particular chapter, we based it on both historical analysis and Ubai's experience of, actually being part of building up to the revolution and participating in the revolution. But I have done several rounds of research in Sudan before, and I've lived in Khartoum. And it is a wonderful, wonderful place with wonderful, wonderful people. Balancing the insider-outsider dynamic is interesting in terms of, I think, getting access and legitimacy. So I found that opposition parties and civil society, etc., were often very keen to discuss mobilization, demobilization, etc. But it was difficult to get access to government back when Bashir was still in place, supporters of the government party, etc. And in that process, I found it helpful to work with female research assistants and to present the project being female and coming from psychology. They were often much more willing to talk to me than I think they would have been if I had been male and working in political science. It's just kind of an atmosphere around it that is less threatening in a way to these political leaders who then want to discuss policy, demobilization strategies with, etc. So for following the revolution, what I had to do was that we did some WhatsApp research so that we reached out and were in contact with a number of revolutionaries for about 6 months, where we then WhatsApp message back and forth when particular things were happening. They were sharing photos, videos, and updates along the way. And we've also done some media analysis. So it's a difficult process for those of us who are used to being on the ground and being able to sit through very long interviews and kind of be there when you get very different material through messages, for example, on WhatsApp. But it's been amazing to then be able to do this with Ubai, who was part of all of this till he had to flee the country and is now based in Egypt.
Thank you. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you. Okay, so I am going to open it up for questions from the audience online. You can use the Q&A to write your questions if you have any, or you can just raise your hand using the raise hand function, and I will enable your mic.
We might have questions from people here as well.
Of course, while we wait for questions from online, we are happy to take questions in the room as well. Yes.
I've kind of seen examples when you're talking about like repression on like social media and things. I see a lot of like campaigns coming through from people trying to fund their way from Gaza through the Egypt border, and those GoFundMe's being shut down, or those people having to say watermelon land of Palestine and things like that. And it kind of makes you feel a little bit helpless. When it comes to engaging with social media, like I've been reposting a lot of campaigns and kind of trying to stay across kind of the voices coming out of Palestine on social media, but there's a way of kind of it filling up your feed and you kind of feeling impotent. How would you recommend kind of staying engaged with kind of the struggles of Palestinians on the ground level? Because the only thing I'm not really seeing any way of, so this is just me babbling, but I'm not really seeing any way of me engaging on a higher level than just kind of reposting people's stories and kind of hashtagging things and commenting and trying to kind of spread voices. Is there a more effective way via social media of kind of bringing those voices to the forefront?
Did you want
Go
to? Yeah, maybe also. I don't know if people have heard the question, but the question is about what more can one do on social media right, for Palestine beyond sharing stories of people. That is right. Does that summarize your?
Yeah, more extreme.
Well, I mean, I think first of all that you know, sorry, that's okay. I think it's great to be sharing stories already. You know, thinking about you know, trying to link this back to what I was presenting earlier on, which is exposing the injustice, exposing the oppression, and so on is very important, especially when there are efforts to hide, deny, or obscure these stories. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. The second is that I guess there are so many different ways to resist, and this is one of the ways that is happening online. But there's also offline ways to do this. So I don't think we need to restrict ourselves to, you know, online action, and thinking about what can also be done offline, right? So joining actions offline, and that there's a range of things that are happening offline as well. You know, starting from I don't know if you're a student here or a staff member.
Staff member.
A staff member, yeah. Okay. But joining efforts on campus that are happening, looking at how our own institutions may be complicit, and what can we do on that level, right? Also, what can we do as consumers? So thinking again, for example, about the BDS campaign, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions campaign, thinking about you know, what actions are being done to pressure to stop the sending weapons to Israel. I mean, these are some of the local ways in which we can think of that, but also holding political representatives accountable. So and yeah, and getting engaged in organized efforts, and yeah, so there's like a range of things that people can do. I mean, these are just immediate thoughts that are coming now, but I'm sure that, you know, others will have more ideas about what can be done to be more involved. And yeah, it would be great. I'm sure that I'm missing so many things as well. But yeah, if anyone else would like to contribute.
Yeah, so for me, like, I think perhaps asking, is it the most effective kind of thing to be doing? It's almost counterproductive. It's a little bit like how we are with environmental behaviors, right? Where we're sometimes like, oh, should I recycle or should I travel less, or which is the most effective? And if I don't know, then, you know, maybe I don't do anything. It's pretty similar when it comes to, you know, political issues like this, where it's not so much about whether it's effective as whether it is effective for you.
Right.
Is this something that helps you achieve the goal you had in mind? If someone is trying to erase people's stories and you go online and you share those stories, that is resistance in a way. That is solidarity in a way. It might not be as effective as perhaps joining you know, the UN and being a carer in Gaza, you know, that way, more directly, perhaps more impactful directly to specific people, but it still has an impact, and it is still important. One of the things that I've heard from Palestinian colleagues and others is that the fact that people are sharing their stories and that they're engaging in things like the encampments and things like that is one of the things that is really bolstering morale. In one of the very few things that are bolstering morale right now in the occupied Palestinian territories. The fact that people feel seen, that they feel that people see them as human, that they appreciate and value their stories, and that they're trying to overcome the silencing of their miseries and their sufferings. I think we often underestimate that as soft, ways of participation. But I think we tend to underestimate the cultural side of politics and of resistance and of repression, and the things that we are doing on the informational side can be just as strategic and just as important and critical as other stuff. If you need to feel like super effective, you can study how people on the opposing side are scaling up their efforts, and perhaps mirroring some of those techniques to get sort of your stories out there in a higher volume, let's say. Thank you. Would anyone like to add something, an answer to that question? Okay. Let's see. Do we have any questions in the Q&A? No. Okay. All right. Any other questions from the? Yes.
Is it okay if the question isn't specific to any panelist, but rather I think about like the book in general?
Yes, feel
Is
free.
there someone to answer that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I think because I think you mentioned that or someone else mentioned that the book is heavily focused on like everyday resistance, or not heavily focused on everyday resistance, but there's a lot of examples, a lot of chapters on everyday resistance. And I think like from the perspective of like, we definitely need to highlight everyday resistance in the sense of highlighting different ways the power is manifested, highlighting that it's not just overt action, like all of that. But I'm thinking more of to what like beyond this and beyond highlighting that people are not being passive, that people are still resisting. What is the analytical utility of us talking about everyday resistance? And I'm thinking of it in terms of also, to what extent is everyday resistance different from resilience? And should we be thinking of everyday resistance in terms of everyday resistance is providing material resources for people, not just material, but psychological resources for people to continue their steadfastness so that they can actually resist in more collective ways and in more organized ways? And I guess I'm just kind of thinking of, where do you see the analytical utility of everyday resistance beyond highlighting that, not that it's not important, beyond because it highlights that, we're not passively facing injustice, even if we're not resisting overtly and so on, but where do we go from there when it comes to everyday resistance? And should we be moving forward by tying it to how it reinforces, not reinforces, but it encourages or gives us the material and psychological resources for different forms of resistance? Is that the way to move forward with that?
Okay, thank you so much for a very, very interesting question. Just in case anybody didn't hear online, the question is on the utility, the analytic utility of the concept of everyday resistance, and if there's any overlaps between that and the concepts of resilience or persistence and resistance. And in the end, how do we connect everyday resistance to the more overt political forms of resistance that are more typically studied?
I could speak a little to that. I don't know, because the authors here didn't write about everyday resistance as much, right? So I can say just a little bit. So, oops, some echo. Shall I try again?
It sounds good in here.
Okay. Yeah, so one thing I think is that everyday resistance really hasn't been conceptualized very well, especially in psychology, but even in other fields. I think it's a very broad category where many different phenomena have been discussed. And James Scott, for example, in his work also talks about some subtle, covert acts of sabotage as acts of everyday resistance, right? Which definitely did slow down production. I think he talks about, I forget the exact context, but right under conditions of forced labor of some sort, for example. Or in Rosales and Langhut's review, they talk about practices of, weaving into Black women's hair in times of slavery, maps to escape, or the same was with blankets, right, as acts of everyday resistance. So I think we oftentimes maybe think of everyday resistance as like simple acts of cultural resistance, maintaining a sense of cultural pride, but there's such a variety of phenomena. So I think to understand the utility of it, one first step is that we just need much more systematic conceptualization and then theorizing around the different categories of everyday resistance within psychology. And another aspect of this is also that one chapter in the book in particular, but a few others as well. So Orazani and Timuri's chapter about the women's life freedom movement, they talk about the relations between everyday resistance as a preparation for, but also accompanying street protest, and the ways in which different resistance strategies feed into and mutually reinforce and prepare for each other. So yeah, the short answer is I think there's a lot of utility in maintaining a focus on everyday resistance, but we need to conceptualize it thoroughly first, because there's a lot of misunderstanding around what it is or what it isn't.
Thank you, Johanna. Would anybody like to add to that, Claudia, Sigrun?
Maybe I can just add one comment. I completely agree. And quite a few of the Sudanese that Ubay spoke to around this aspect of it being, or the revolution being presented as something very surprising, they were saying, well, that takes away from all the things that we've been doing, all the kind of smaller scale resistance we're engaged in, everything we do on more of a daily basis to keep the momentum going, even if we're not massively out in the street. So there's also, I think, an issue of agency, right? That you're being recognized for these efforts that actually are then a preparation for further action, and that then enables the more large scale, at least in Sudan, revolution at a later stage.
Thank you, Sigrun. Would you like to add anything?
Well, I can't think of more than what has already been said.
But did you get an answer?
I don't think there is one answer.
Yeah, I mean, essentially that is the answer, is that everyday resistance, there's so little known about it, and there's such a wide range of ways to use it and functions that it plays, that asking about everyday resistance as a whole is kind of, I don't know, I wouldn't say pointless, but it doesn't really get you anywhere. So, it might be a bit more productive to ask about specific tactics. We still don't know, for example, whether people are different when they're engaging in strategies like boycott versus sabotage versus, cyber hacking versus bot production versus. It's a lot of different ways that people can engage in resistance and in the construction of resistance, even underneath sort of the behavioral level, when it's just about normalizing and shaping the normativity of certain ideas or certain ideologies as well. There's a lot missing in our understanding of these processes to begin with. So, if you think about it in biological terms, we're still very much in the Linnaean part of the science. We're still naming and describing things rather than, aiming to understand exactly how their mechanisms and processes work. And until you do have some kind of classification, categorization, and some names and things, despite the likelihood that a lot of these kinds of categories are going to end up being false categories, and we end up reimagining the labels we use and things like that. But even with that, not having those categories has been a very big obstacle, and not knowing what was out there has been a very big obstacle for progress in understanding how to leverage everyday resistance, how to increase everyday resistance, how to understand what everyday resistance implies in terms of the continuity and persistence and escalation of more overt kinds of resistance over time. Still very early days. And then I think in general, the book, if there's anything that one sentence that comes out of it is, it's still a very, very dreadfully impoverished area of research. I mean, we have some excellent work in the book, but compare that to the amount of work that's been done on collective action in Europe and the United States, and there is no comparison. You have thousands and thousands of papers on that in the literature versus 10 chapters or 15 chapters, and a few papers here and there on the other. So still very early days.
Why is that though, do you think? Why do you think it's so difficult to kind of find that information and to kind of connect with those particular people having those experiences? Do you think it's because people's experiences, we're talking about categories, but they're so different within those categories? Everybody's lived experience of something is really different. They bring a different kind of perspective to everything. So even when you categorize, it's so diverse within that, isn't it? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So is that, would you say that's why it's difficult to kind of understand and get to grips with that side of things?
I can talk about this all day long, but I'll leave maybe some space to for others to maybe address this first.
No, go for it, Fouad. Now I'm really curious.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this has to do with sort of the biases that exist in psychology and sort of where psychology has come from. Psychology is a Western science. Psychology is a science by aspiration, and so it tends to mimic a lot of the physical sciences in ways that are not good for it, because it doesn't actually work in the same way. Or actually, maybe it does. It's just that we used old science that and never really updated our ideas of what science is. Because even in physics or biology or in other the hard sciences, people have moved away from the kinds of approaches that we use in terms of our measurement, in terms of our statistics, in terms of our general approach to how we study things. So there's a very strong quantitative bias, as you might imagine. There's a very strong experimental bias in the discipline. You can't do experiments with people on oppression and repression and things like that in a way that is actually informative of what's happening in the field. It's one of those subjects where external validity actually matters quite as much as internal validity. And it's also, I think, one of those things where this idea of valuing central tendencies isn't helpful. And we're looking at things in linear ways also isn't helpful.
Yeah.
As you saw with what Claudia told us, there's lots of non-linearities. There's also a lot of dynamic feedback processes. These are not things that you can see in the common toolbox that psychologists use. There's a lot of different factors at a lot of different levels that are involved psychologists generally are not very good at knowing what's going on outside their level of analysis, right? So thinking about context and sort of political structure, there aren't that many, even political psychologists, who have a grounding in political science and can engage as both a political scientist and as a psychologist. Um, in terms of collaborations across disciplines, there aren't that many. Aside from all of this, there's a question of epistemic value. Like, who is the target of study here, and do they matter? And is their experience worth hearing about, knowing about, understanding, for the people with power? So for a long, long time, for example, no one bothered with anything research-wise on civil conflict or on corruption or anything like that, because it just didn't seem relevant to people who had lots of money and funding and funding agencies in the West. And so, that stuff didn't get studied in psychology in outside, the West, and it didn't get studied here because apparently, or so they thought, there was no such thing going on here. Now that things are changing a little bit, and they're realizing we don't know anything about this, and we need to. Now they're more interested in going, to the global majority and asking, how did this happen? How can we learn from you to prevent this from happening for us? But it's a bit too late for that. Once these processes start, they have a bit of an inertial momentum involved, and one of the reasons why they're getting more air now is that, people with power are finally realizing this stuff matters to them too, and it isn't just about brown and black people in places no one cares about. So that's part of it, I'm sure. I don't know. Would anyone like to add anything?
I mean, maybe just very quickly, there's also simply a prototype of what resistance is. And I think that actually applies not just in the global north, but more generally, right? We think of resistance as either, protests or some kind of revolution and uprising, but definitely organized, collective, and visible.
Yeah, there is a bit of a sexist component to it, right? And a bit of a sensationalist bias as well. Like, we like big, loud eruptions of stuff, especially the more negative stuff. So there's that negativity bias, there's that sensationalist bias, but there's also the sexist element where, we pay more attention to the aggressive, to the offensive, to the angry, to the sudden and abrupt and eruptions of stuff. And we're not as considerate and mindful of the importance of the stuff that happens under the current, in the background, over longer periods of time, culturally, socially. These are things that are sort of more, stereotypically feminized and seen as less political and less important for politics, which is seen to be much more of a playground for the aggressive and coercive uses of power. All right. Let's see. Do we have any more questions? Oh, thank you, Sandra. Did I miss any? Okay, so we have a question from Somehow related to the biases I mentioned, I wonder where the concept of activist burnout fits within the existing research on resistance and repression in social and political psychology. There's only very few studies in the literature they address activist burnout in terms of resignation from organized resistance or movements, alongside emergence of mental health symptoms. Is it possible that what is called activist burnout could represent a transition between different resistance tactics, shifting from more overt to less overt? That kind of shift might allow individuals to protect themselves while still engaging in resistance. Bringing resistance into psychology not only broadens the discussion beyond street protests, but can also reconstruct the narratives around activist burnout. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, would you like to comment? Yeah, yeah. I think in terms of the activist burnout aspect, in some cases, yes, I believe activist burnout could simply be a marker of someone getting to the end with one tactic and getting to a point where they might decide to go on a different branch in the decision tree in terms of how they want to move forward. And that kind of the burnout syndrome might be one of the motivating factors behind that shift. That is not the case as far as I know, and as far as I can tell from the work in the book. That's not always the case. Shifts in tactics don't necessarily happen just or only because, or even necessarily when there is burnout. It happens for a variety of other reasons, some of which have to do with what's happening to the activists themselves, but not terribly too much, actually, surprisingly so. There's quite a lot of it that has more to do with what's happening with their friends and family, and the decisions and choices that they're making, and the responses that those choices are getting from the repressors. So as we saw again with Claudia's talk, what's happening indirectly, are my friends and family being harshly repressed, or are they being somewhat repressed? How is that going to make me respond? I'm sure that if we look even more granularly, that we won't just see an inverted U, that we will see differences in responses in terms of what kinds of repression are being faced by our friends and family. Are our friends and family being disappeared? That's going to have a very different impact than if they're being fined or arrested even. Are they being killed? That's going to have a very different impact as well. So again, we just simply are not there in terms of the level of detail to even begin to answer that question in terms of when and to what extent burnout might play a role in shifts in resistance tactics. We do know that there are some more general predictors. We know, for example, that when movements start failing, that people look for alternatives more assiduously. They might try multiple things at the same time more often. But again, that's a contextual thing. It's not really so much about the person themselves. Now, there are some indications that that individual differences and individual psychology matter to some extent, but those influences will be relatively confined to smaller sort of decisions, right? If you're a relatively shy introvert kind of person who doesn't really like to put yourself out there as a public speaker, but your group and everyone around you who matters to you is saying you need to speak out, you're going to have to speak out whether you like to or not. You don't want to lose face, you don't want to be a traitor to your group, you don't want to let down the cause. So, again, individual decision-making here is highly context dependent And we can't really understand it without understanding those contexts and understanding also the range of the behaviors that individuals can develop in those contexts. So this book is mostly more like a call for us to start and sort of a palette of examples of what this kind of research can offer and all the ways in which we are lacking still understanding all of these things. Thank you so much. Yeah, okay. I'll take one last question, whether from the room or online, and then unfortunately we will have to wrap up. All right, thank you so much for everybody. Thank you to the Center for Inequalities and the Institute for Life Court Development for sponsoring this event, and for Reem for coming today, and for our speakers online as well, and for all of you for your attention and your interest in this work. Please feel free to email me for discussing any of these topics. We are recording this session, and we hope to post this on our website, which is resistancepsych.blogspot.com. But hopefully we'll also get that posted on our ILD website and other places like that. Thank you again, and have a great night, everyone.
Thank you very, very much. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. And now we can all head over and have our snacks and enjoy ourselves. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.